Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome back. We are continuing Masechet Beitzah. Masechet Beitzah Daf Yud Gimel Amud Bet. We got to near the bottom. We spoke yesterday about the difference between Gemar Melacha for Maaser and Melacha for Shabbat. We saw they are not necessarily the same, right? We had this discussion. We're going through different methods of eating grains, wheat and barley, and peeling and doing things which might involve certain melachot of dash, maybe with a little bit of a change. And we saw that whenever it is achilat arai, so there one is not required to separate trumot and masrot at that point. But if it's achilat keva, one would be. We said in the same way where that it's considered achilat arai, it's not considered melacha for masrot. So too for Shabbat. And then the writer said, no, wait a minute, that's not correct. Because we said, right, barley, if you're peeling them one at a time, that is not a melacha for masrot. But if you're doing a few at a time, that is, but that would actually be permitted on Shabbat. So we said, when the Brayza said, v'chen Shabbat, or when Gemara said, v'chen Shabbat, it's referring to the second case, which is molel melilot, relating to wheat. And there we said, menapech al yad, meaning you have the wheat and the chaff together in your hands, and you move it from one hand to the other, so you do it in a small amounts, that would be permitted on Shabbat as well. And then the Gemara said, how can it be that you can have a difference between what the definition of melacha by masrot and the difference of melacha and the definition of melacha by Shabbat? We brought other examples where we find that distinction does exist. And the answer was melechet machshevet asra Torah. But when it comes to Shabbat, we have a whole different category, what's called melechet machshevet. So melechet machshevet means it has to be, I guess, considered this melacha. And there's a number of different, when you go through really Masechet Beitzah as well, but also Masechet Shabbat, there are all different categories, also different implementations of this idea of Melechet Machshevet. So Melechet Machshevet means it has to be a constructive action rather than a destructive action. There has to be intent, right? If it's a no mitkaven, if it's something which I don't intend to do, that is not Melechet Machshevet. Much ink has been spilled about when I have a case on Shabbat where it's a no mitkaven, I don't intend to perform the Melacha. However, the melacha will definitely be performed. That's what's called a psik reisha. Psik reisha means so we have a number of times the Gemara Masechet Shabbat tells us that everybody agrees, even Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, who argue about a no mitkaven, but they agree when it comes to a psik reisha that it's going to be forbidden, right? And then there are all sorts of discussions. What about psik reisha de nichale, psik reisha de lo nichale, etc. That comes later. That's really in the Rishonim. The Gemara does not actually make that distinction. But all of that also sugya of psik reisha is based on the idea of melechet machshevet. Melechet machshevet also means something has to be permanent and not temporary. It also means that what I'm doing is directly causing the action. It's not indirect. Right? And in this case, we're talking about melechet machshevet being considered being sort of a professional action as opposed to just something simple. It's called, I guess, a melechet hediot. I'll just note that all these cases, right, each one has to be studied by itself. Each case and each application of melechet machshevet, but nonetheless, if that element is lacking, so that would remove the element of it being an isur d'oraita. It's only melechet machshevet asrat Torah. However, Rabbanan added in a number of conditions. So very oftentimes, it won't be melechet machshevet, and therefore it won't be asur midoraita, but it will still be asur midrabanan. Right. And another common one, which I forgot to mention, is shinoi. Melechet machshevet means you do it in the normal way of doing things. But if it's what's called kilachar yad, which literally means the back of your hand, but with a shinoi, in a significantly different version, so that is not going to be an isur d'oraita anymore, because that is not melechet machshevet. It will be, however, an isur d'rabanan. And as we've spoken many times, right, and this is going to come up now in our sugya, difference between an isur d'oraita and isur d'rabanan is not that I have to listen to the Torah and I don't have to listen to the rabbis. I have to listen to the rabbis as well. It would still be forbidden. However, there are a number of leniencies that are built into the system, so to speak, when we're dealing with an isur d'rabanan. That's why it's always important to know what the definition is. And as I said, it's going to come up here, but we're slightly jumping the gun. So we're about 5 lines from the bottom, 5 lines from the end of the page. We said that this molel melilot is going to be mutar on Shabbat. So again, what is molel melilot? Is when you have the stalks of the sheaves of wheat in your hand, right? And to get the wheat from inside, you sort of rub it together in your hand, and then you get the wheat out that you can eat, and it separates it from the outer casing. Now, what melacha would be involved? Yeah, so it would be again This would be the melacha of maybe of dash or mefarek as a tolada of dash, which is threshing. But yeah, since you're not doing it in the ordinary way, that's why it's going to be permitted. That's not considered the melacha. So the question is, we say Amolam Melilot, says the Gemara now, the 2 dots, 5 lines from the bottom. Yud Gimel Amud Bet. Those just joined. Ketzad Molel. Abaye Mishmeid Rav Yosef Amar Chada Achada. Okay. So how do we do this? Again, you're sort of rubbing it together in your fingers to soften the wheat and get it from the inside. So says Rashi, Ketzad Molel, the Yom Tov the Amran Nael Molelin Melilot. Vaha vadai shinoi bai mi'uvdadochol. Right? You need a change. When we said molalim melilot, clearly there has to be some sort of a difference from the way that you would do it on a weekday. Sorry, just one correction. As Rashi points out, it says ketzad molel b'yom tov. Right? So we're not talking about on Shabbat. We're talking about that this would be allowed on Yom Tov. You could ask why do I need a change at all? Right? Is this not part of ochel nefesh? I'm doing it in order to eat the food. So again, we're dealing with the melacha of dash, the melacha of threshing, which is much earlier in the process, and that is a melacha which is generally done for a long time, done for many days, and that's a melacha which is done in the field, not done in the home, and therefore even that, the ordinary way is still going to be an isur from the in isur melacha on Yom Tov. But if I'm doing it now in not an unusual way, so that would be allowed. And particularly if we say that the Yisur of Ochel Nefesh here, the Yisur of Dash is Midrabanan, so then we can understand why it would be allowed. So anyway, how do you do it? What's the way here? So say Ketzad Molel, Abaye Mishmeid Rav Yosef Machada Achada, one on one, one finger against the other. That's the way you're moleling these mililot. A difference now of opinion in terms of what the shinoi is, which is necessary. So Abaye said in the name of Rav Yosef Chada Chada. Rav Avya Mashmeid Rav Yosef Amar Chada Tarte. And it says no, it's one your thumb against 2 fingers. Okay, that's going to be the way of doing it. Rav Amar Kevan de Mishane Afilu Chada Akulu Nami. Right? Rava says no. He says since you've already made some sort of a shinoi, you're doing it a little bit. You're doing normally you would do it with your whole hand, and here you're just doing it with your fingers. That's already a change, so it doesn't matter. You can have your thumb against the rest of your hand, against all the fingers. That would be fine. So ketzad menapeach. So the second step is okay, and this would be allowed on Shabbat as well. That's what Rashi points out. It said Damrin La'el lemachar. Menapeach miyad liad b'Shabbat. If on Yom Tov or before Shabbat you had softened this wheat and sort of caused it to separate one from another, now you want to sort of sort through it. So how do you do that? Okay, so you have to do it from your tips of your fingers and not with your hand. Again, that's in order to make that sort of difference. So machku ala b'ma'arva. That which we just said, that was the explanation of Rav. And now it says in Eretz Yisrael they would sort of they rejected this and sort of make fun of this explanation, and they would say no, since kevan de mishani, again you're doing it in a different way because you're doing it with one hand instead of 2 hands, and therefore you can use your whole hand. You don't have to change in such a way as well. That's what they say. That's what Rabbi Elazar says. Do this with one hand, but with all your might, with your whole hand, as much as you want. Okay. Now that we are discussing the different melachot of related to food preparation, again, which are not going to be permitted on Yom Tov, or are only going to be permitted on Yom Tov with a shinoi, that's going to be a discussion of our next Mishnah. Next Mishnah, we're now on Daf Yud Dalet at the top, talks about grinding spices on Yom Tov. And again, you'll say to me, well, what's the big deal? You're grinding spices in order to eat them, and that should be mutar. The answer is no, because grinding is a derivative of the melacha of tochen. Tochen is the melacha of grinding, and shchikat samanim. right? It's familiar to us from Shabbat, for example. The reason why we have restrictions on taking medicines on Shabbat and on Yom Tov is because there's a gzera of shchikat samamanim. In the olden days, it used to be people would, I guess, make their own medicines. And if you think, it's not really like the pills and the capsules and the tablets that we have today. But once upon a time, it was herbs and leaves and all sorts of things. And I guess everybody had a pestle and mortar in their house, and that's how they would grind these herbs, and that's how they would make medicine. And therefore, Chazal made a gezerah that said that a healthy person is not allowed to take medicine on Shabbat. This is something people get confused with quite often. So just have to state there are different levels of illness in terms of how a person is considered right, healthy or ill for Shabbat and for other halachot as well. So there is a cholesh yesh bo sakana, which is somebody who is in a situation of pikuach nefesh. Of course, you're allowed to do whatever they need. You can be mechalel Shabbat, all right, or whatever is necessary for a cholesh yesh bo sakana. Then there's a cholesh ein bo sakana, which is somebody who is considered an ill person, but it's not deathly ill, right? It's not pikuach nefesh. If they don't, so you can't just do anything for them. But generally speaking, the other definition Chazal give is what's called nafal lemishkav, which means a person is bedridden, right? A person is not able to get up. So cholesh she'en bo sakana, somebody who's nafal lemishkav. Now, such an individual can take medicine on Shabbat. I'm not now talking about being mechalel Shabbat, all right, or doing melachot. That's a different discussion. It's not our topic right now. But a person who is ill, right? So a person is bedridden. A person has an infection. A person is on antibiotics, a fever, whatever it is. Right? That person is considered ill, and there is no restriction on that person taking medicine on Shabbat. However, there's the third level, what's called mechush ba'alma. Mechush ba'alma means a person is not. You wouldn't define the person as ill. Say a person has a little bit of a headache or a little bit of a slight ailment, right? And a person's generally basically healthy, but they have maybe a little bit of a sore throat or whatever it is. So the restriction against taking medicine on Shabbat applies only to a mechush ba'alma. Chazal did not impose that gzera on a person who is ill. But why is there a restriction? There is no isur d'oraita of taking medicine. But Chazal said that since people are going to come to, we don't want people to come and grind on Shabbat, and therefore there's what's called shchikat samanim, in order that you aren't going to grind. If you aren't actually sick, right? Well, what's the logic? That if a person's ill already, they'll take the medicine that they need. But we don't want it to become a free-for-all, essentially. This is what Rabbi Wein was discussing last week on Pirkei Avot, Asu Siag LeTorah. Right? So this is one of the siagim which they made. Now, there is a large discussion in the poskim nowadays, right? I'm not sure when the last time you saw anybody going and grinding their own medicine was. So the reason no longer applies, but nonetheless, we have a principle that afal pisha batel tam, lo batel takana. So the original institution is still in place, and therefore, for a person who is healthy, they would not take medicine. But since the reason, Rav Osha Vai says like this, since the reason doesn't apply anymore, if there are other reasons to be lenient, if there are other mitigating factors, there are other things to join in, then we can be more lenient. So we can actually, in certain cases, be more lenient about this than we were once upon a time, because that reason doesn't apply. But all of that introduction is regarding the melacha of tochen, of grinding, which is certainly forbidden on Shabbat. So you might say, well, what's the problem on Yom Tov? Grinding you're doing in order to, here we're talking about grinding spices or grinding salt in order to add it into your food. That is ochal nefesh. But as we've explained, and we've just seen it by Menechet Dash, we're now going to see by Menechet Tochen. The next Mishnah is going to deal with Menechet Borer, that it's not so simple. Not every malacha is allowed for ochel nefesh. So the malachot like cooking, which you always do in the kitchen and you do for what you need immediately, that's fine. Malachot which are done in the field, like plowing and harvesting, and which are done in large quantities as well, those are going to be forbidden. So tochen would seem to fit into that category. Based on that introduction, why tochen is forbidden, we're now going to have to understand why the Mishnah actually allows us to do it. But let's see. So the Mishnah now, at the top of Daf Yud Daled Amud Aleph, we have Machloket Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai omrim, תבלין נידוחין במדוך של עץ, והמלח בפח ובעץ הפרור. בית הלל אומרים תבלין נידוחין כדרכן, במדוך של אבן, והמלח במדוך של עץ. Okay, so we have two categories. But machloket Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, in terms of how you grind spices, so there are spices and there is salt. The Gemara is going to explain that salt is something which is much, much more common. The person is going to use a lot more of, and that's going to have halachic ramifications as well. But Beit Shammai say tavlin, so ordinary spices, nidochin, if you want to grind spices on Yom Tov, so it has to be done by madoch shel eitz. You have to use a pestle which is wooden. I guess normally they would use a stone one, and this is wood. So this is going to be a shinoi. It's a small shinoi. It's not a major change, but that is what you would do. So Beit Shammai amrim tavlin nidochin madoch shel eitz. Okay, when it comes to tavlin, that is the change that you have to make. It's a minor shinoi. But when it comes to salt, you have to use sort of a wooden spoon and a big bowl. So that is going to be a major change. That's not the ordinary way of doing it. So that's something we see. That's according to Beit Shammai. For spices, you have to use there needs to be some change, small shinoi. But for melach, has to be a significant change. Now, Beit Hillel omrim tavlin nidochin kedarkan b'madoch shel even. But Hillel says, when it comes to spices, then you can just grind them in the ordinary way. In a madoch shel even of stone. V'amelach madoch shel eitz. When it comes to salt, then you have to have a small shinoi. That has to be in a wooden with a wooden pestle. So both Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel agree that there are two levels here. Both Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel agree that when it comes to salt, that it's much more. It's more what's the word? More stringent. Okay, when it comes to spices, we're much more lenient. According to Beit Hillel, you don't even have to have any shinoi when it comes to spices. According to Beit Shammai, you have to have a little shinoi. So the question is, first of all, the Rishonim ask on the Mishnah, I don't understand. According to Beit Hillel, and we pass like Beit Hillel, if the whole point is that tochen is a melacha which I'm not really allowed to perform, how is it that here I am allowed to perform tochen without any change? So the simplest way of explaining it would be to say as follows. There is a machloket, a big machloket amongst the Rishonim, when I say that certain melachot, even related to ochel nefesh, are not permitted on Yom Tov, is that d'oraita or d'Rabbanan? Told you how we started off the shiur, talking about d'oraita and d'Rabbanan. It could be that when the Torah said that the Torah allows us to perform melechet ochel nefesh, it's only certain melachot of ochel nefesh which the Torah is allowing, but other melachot the Torah never allowed, so it's going to still be an isur d'oraita. That's one way of learning. Or I might say that actually the Torah allowed all, said for the sake of ochel nefesh, you can do melacha, which melacha, any melacha, whatever you want. Then came along Rabbanan and said, no, only certain melachot we're going to allow and certain we're not. If we say that it's an isur d'Rabbanan, so then it's relatively straightforward to understand. If we say, and this is the Ran suggests, that the melacha of tochen, again, grinding is generally done for large amounts at a time. It's done in the field. It's done for many, many days. And therefore, Chachamim said it's not appropriate to do tochen on Yom Tov. However, there's an application of tochen, which is just for now and immediate. The person's grinding a few spices in their kitchen. So that's okay. There, Chachamim lo gazru. Right? The case of with the shinoi, the case with the shinoi works according to everybody, because even if we say that tochen is midoraita, we gave a whole introduction at the beginning of the shiur that Torah Shra Melechet Machshevet. That would apply for Shabbat, that would apply for Yom Tov as well. And therefore, once I have a shinoi, it's no longer an isur d'oraita. So Chachamim could say, if you're going to do tochen with a shinoi, so that's fine. But it might be, according to Beit Hillel, the Chachamim said as well that tavlint, in order to grind it, that's not considered a prohibition at all in the first place. Okay. So that is the discussion, that is the machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel regarding grinding spices, grinding salt, etc. Says the Gemara, right? When it comes to, according to everybody, both Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, as we saw there's two things that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel agree on. They agree on the fact that salt is a different level to spices, and they both agree that when it comes to salt, there needs to be some sort of a shinoi. Okay, Beit Shammai said it has to be a significant shinoi. They said pacho beitza paror. Beit Hillel said it has to be a small shinoi, madoch shel eitz. But everybody agrees you need a shinoi when it comes to salt, either it's more stringent than when it comes to spices. So why is that? What's the difference? Why do we differentiate between melach and tavlin? What is the reason? So Rav Huna Rav Chizda, we have this is one of those places. Sometimes the Gemara brings a machloket. right? We know who the machloket is between, but we don't know who said what. Sometimes you find with Rav Huna and Rav Chisda, sometimes you find with Ami and Rav Ashi, right? Different Tanaim and Amoraim where we find this. But over here, Rav Huna and Rav Chisda. So one of them said, Chad amar kol hakderot kulan tzrichot melach, ve'en kol hakderot tzrichot tavlin. Okay, so one opinion says every pot needs food. Doesn't mean people don't know how to need salt. Excuse me. It doesn't mean people don't know how to cook, but it means salt is the much more common a common spice, right? A person always needs. You go, what spice do you bring to the table? You bring salt, right? Some people bring other things, sometimes you don't, but you always have salt. So one opinion is you don't know necessarily what you're going to cook before Yom Tov, but whatever you're going to cook, you're going to need salt. And therefore, so what's the point? The point is you knew you were going to need salt, so you should have made it before. You should have done it before. Says Rashi, Kol hakderot, kol minei tavshil tzrichot melach. All sorts of foods are going to need salt. Hilkach met mo havayada dibai leliduch. And therefore, from yesterday, from before Yom Tov, he knew that he was going to need it. However, not everything needs spices. Person doesn't know what he's going to eat tomorrow. So depending on what he cooks on Yom Tov, maybe you'll need pepper, and maybe you'll need cumin, and maybe you'll need garlic, and maybe you'll need paprika, but it doesn't know. Okay, that is one opinion. Opinion number two, right? So that was either Rav Huna or Rav Chisda. Now this is either Rav Chisda or Rav Huna, who says, Chanamar, kol hatavlin mefigin ta'aman, umelach enam mafigat ta'aman. Says, no, all the other spices, what's the problem? Is if you make them earlier on, they're going to lose their taste, right? Whereas salt is going to stay. It's going to be the same. Based this, by the way, this is one of the Gemarot from which the Rishonim learn. Now, what's the distinction between the melachot which I can perform on Yom Tov and the melachot which I cannot perform on Yom Tov? So I've said before, one of the reasons it's slightly confusing, you really only start to get a handle for Hilchot Yom Tov once you've gone through the entire Masechet Beitzah and you've learned all the halachot, and then you start learning them again. There's really one organic unit. There's nowhere in the Gemara where it says, okay, these are the principles of when you can do a malacha and when you can't do a malacha. This applies by everything, right? But particularly by Hilchot Yom Tov, you see it. Nowadays, if we were to go to write it, you look at the contemporary Svarim, right? So the contemporary works of Kitzurei Halacha, etc., Pninei Halacha, and works like that. So they'll open up and they'll say, okay, these are the principles on Yom Tov. This is the malacha you can do. This is the malacha you can't do. Gemara doesn't work that way. The Gemara gives us different examples. It goes through. Okay, here's an example about, now we're talking about grinding spices, and then tomorrow we'll talk about sorting, and then we'll talk about threshing. We'll just talk as it goes, case by case. So the Rishonim had to come and extrapolate from these different cases. What is the principle? I mean, it's very, very clear throughout that there are certain melachot which we can do, certain melachot which we can't do. The principle of Ochel Nefesh, the Gemara tells us. But it doesn't tell us why and what and when. So we have to look at what comes out from the examples. One of the things that comes out very clearly from this example is that something you could have done before Yom Tov, you should have done, and something you couldn't do before Yom Tov, you can do on Yom Tov, right? And that's one of the understandings. The reason we can cook and all these things we've discussed before. With cooking, this is similar to the second reason over here, right? In theory, you can cook everything before Yom Tov. Nowadays, lots of people do. Okay, but there's a difference between freshly cooked foods and food that's been reheated up. Everybody knows that if you have freshly cooked schnitzel, right, you can't compare freshly cooked schnitzel to schnitzel that you cooked 2 days ago and is now on the hot plate, or that you've taken out of the freezer or whatever. And therefore, there's a qualitative difference. Therefore, you're still allowed to cook on Yom Tov. So same thing here with the spices. You made the spices before. If you ground up with salt, it doesn't make a difference. You ground up your salt yesterday, you ground up your salt a week ago, it's going to be fine. But with these spices, if you ground it up earlier, it's going to lose its sharpness, it's going to lose its taste, and therefore you're allowed to make it on Yom Tov. So either for the reason that we say that you know that you're going to need salt, or the reason that salt doesn't lose its taste, that's why we are more stringent when it comes to grinding the salt on Yom Tov itself. So what's the nafkamina between the two reasons? Says the Gemara, Mai benayu, right? What is the nafkamina? What's the practical difference? Ika benayu de yada maik de rabbi leveshule. Okay, so one nafkamina is if you knew what you were going to cook, You knew exactly what you were going to cook and which spices you would need. So according to the first reason, you would still have to be machmir by a tavlin. According to the second reason, we would not. Inami, alternatively, b'morika. A morika is a type of spice. It's a type of spice, as Rashi, tavlin shamorika ika benayu, sheyesh kdera, shemetablin ota b'kurkum, ve'eno mefik ta'amo im nidoch mib'od yom. Okay, it's a type of food where the spice you use this kurkum, which is not going to lose its taste if it was done earlier on. But you didn't know what else you were going to cook the next day. So according to this reason, according to the second reason, you would be according to the second reason, the tavlin would be the same as melach, but according to the first reason, the melach would still be more machmir. Okay, so those are the two nafkaminot between those two reasons. The Gemara now says, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Kol nidochin kedarkan, v'afilo melach. Okay, so this is a variety which is very different to what our Mishnah said. There's a difference between melach and tavlin. Yeah, the Gemara says, or this statement, this brighter says, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Kol nidochin kedarkan. You don't need to have a shinoi. Everything can be ground in the normal way, and even salt. But didn't you say that salt actually needs a shinoi? So Hudama ki haitana. So that follows one opinion in the Tanaim, but this follows a different opinion in the Tanaim. The Tanya Rabbi Meir lo nechlaku beit Shammai beit Hillel ala nidochin shenidochin kedarkan umelach imahen. So yeah, we have a Braita which is going to be a different opinion on our Mishnah. We've spent the whole Gemara until now explaining the difference between salt and spices, whether it's according to Beit Shammai, whether it's according to Beit Hillel. That is one tradition. That is one version of their machloket based on our Mishnah. But now we have a Braita which has a different version of their machloket, whereby salt would be the same as spices. Okay, we'll stop there, and we'll go into more next week. Now I think next Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken, is Yom Yerushalayim, so there probably won't be a shiur on Wednesday, but we'll be back on Thursday as usual.